Dear colleagues, a very warm welcome on behalf of the University of York to the Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre Black History Month Roundtable. I'm Professor Kiran Trahan, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Partnerships and Engagement at the University of York. The theme of this roundtable has never been more important than it is today. And it's an area that I care deeply and passionately about, like so many of you in the room. So I'm delighted to be opening the roundtable today and to welcome an incredible, diverse and rich set of speakers. Critically exploring approaches to race and the social sciences and humanities is a vital agenda, not just for today, but also for our futures. This is important for us as a university because we as a university, if we think about how we harness the momentum behind the Black Lives Matter movement as a moment for tangible, permanent action to address racial inequality affecting students and staff, then it's absolutely vital for us to consider what universities could and should be doing to tackle structural racism. And here at York, we've made a really strong public commitment to addressing race and racial inequalities. And I'm very proud to be leading that agenda. And in doing so, we're acknowledging that our own institutional shortcomings. Our commitment requires us to be honest, to be bold, to be purposeful, but most of all, it requires us to work together to address structural racism in order to make a measurable difference. And by measurable difference, I mean moving from talk to enactment. And that's why this debate, this discussion, this roundtable is so vital. And then finally, I want to take this opportunity to thank the speakers for giving up their time to be here today, and to my colleagues in GDC for their passion, for their commitment, but most of all, their desire to tackle and address the important challenges of today and of the future. I know this is going to be both a thought-provoking and challenging and exciting debate and conversation. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Henrice.
Thank you, Kiran, for your kind introduction to this session. As Kiran just said, this session is hosted by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre. I'm Henrike Altink. I'm one of the co-directors of the centre, and I'm based in the history department. I work on Caribbean race history. I'm here today with my colleague, Dr. Ingrid van Graven, who is a lecturer in international development in the Department of Politics. The IGDC is an interdisciplinary research and teaching community for equitable global development. We undertake interdisciplinary research, particularly focusing on social justice, on global health, and on sustainable environments. And we also offer a BA program and a PhD program in global development. The Centre brings together researchers from across the humanities, the social and the natural sciences within the University of York, but also globally. And we also encourage our researchers to work with one another, as well as with policymakers and practitioners to address global challenges. Before we start this seminar, I want to mention a few housekeeping points. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, but only the video and the audio of the panelists. Attendees' mics and videos are off, so you won't be recorded. The only thing that will be recorded are any questions you may have. But you can also post those questions anonymously. So if you have any questions for our panelists, you can use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, the one furthest to the right. If you have any more technical questions, then please ask that in the chat function, and our webinar host, Tara, will be able to help you if you have any technical matters. If you are tweeting, please find us on #IGDC webinar, and of course also follow us on @York-IGDC. And I'll hand over now to Ingrid.
Thank you so much, Enrique and Karen. So hi everyone again, and welcome. So I'd like to introduce this specific panel and the panelists very briefly before we get into the discussion. So in light of Black History Month in the US this month, and the increasing concerns and interest in decolonizing the university and the curriculum more generally, we found this to be a particularly pertinent and urgent moment to discuss to what extent our disciplines are racist. So it's a fairly old discussion in academia, but it's only now emerging in the mainstream academic discussions, and in particularly in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests last year. Many academics that maybe hadn't actively thought about how their work relates to race before were forced to scrutinize their own biases and racism within their own disciplines and institutions. So given that IGDC is an interdisciplinary center, we're particularly interested in exploring how race is dealt with across different disciplines. So both politics and economics that are represented here have been criticized for being largely founded on Eurocentric understandings of the world that often paper over colonial legacies, the legacies of the slave trade and racism, and that neglect insights and contributions from the non-Western world. So this is what has led to these campaigns to decolonize the university and the curriculum. And in this panel, we have experts from politics and economics, from academia and policy that will address these problems and how they manifest themselves in their own field, and the movements in the field to address the discipline's shortcomings. So we have Robbie Shilliam with us, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science of Johns Hopkins University. His expertise includes the political and intellectual complicities of colonialism and race in the global order. He's working on a rereading of classical political economy through its intimate relationship to Atlantic slavery, a retrieval of Ethiopianism as a critical orientation towards a global order, and South-South anti-colonial connections. And his book, Decolonizing Politics, will be released later this month, I think, very soon. And Derek Hamilton is a Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race, Stratification, and the Political Economy at the New School. His accomplishments include recently being profiled in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and being featured in Politico magazine's 50 Ideas Shaping American Politics and the People Behind Them. And Dr. Rhonda Sharp is the founder and president of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. Her expertise includes gender and racial inequality, representation and diversity in economics and STEM, and the demography of higher education. She's also the co-editor of the Review of Black Political Economy. So we're very excited to have them with us. And so we asked them 4 questions that I believe will be shown on your screen soon. How has your discipline studied race and race relations? What are the most interesting recent developments in the way it has studied race? What obstacles will the discipline need to overcome to study race more effectively? And what are the consequences of the racial blind spots in your own field? So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to the panelists to discuss these questions. So they have 10 minutes each to discuss them, and then we'll start the roundtable. So Robbie, would you like to take over?
Thank you, Ingrid. Thanks, Henrisa and Tara and Kieran and everybody who put this one together. So, you know, telling academics what to do is like herding cats. They don't really do it, yeah? So I am going to address those 4 questions, but I thought the best way to do it would maybe just to give you a bit of a recent history of things that we've been doing in my political science department at Johns Hopkins. And we, after the summer and Black Lives Matter back on the streets again, a few of us decided to write a document on sculpting a anti-racist political science, and to getting commitment from our department that we would actually have that as one of our main kind of principles and purposes, which has happened. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we put into that document and why. And it's important for Hopkins because, in fact, Hopkins is very probably alongside Columbia University is responsible for the gestation of political science as a formal discipline and a racist and if not eugenic discipline. Hopkins, President Gilman, the first president of Hopkins, basically turned to Germany for models on what a PhD conferring institution would be. You know, Hopkins is often known as the first kind of graduate university in the US, you know, conferring its own graduate degrees. And he hired people like Herbert Baxter Adams, who was a historian who set up the History and Politics seminar at Hopkins. Now, Adams, like many people, were, including Gilman, were influenced by Teutonism, right? This idea that there's a particular heredity coming out of the ancient forests of Germany, which find their best expression in England, becomes Anglo-Saxonism, travels across the Atlantic into the New England towns. And this heredity, which is a race heredity, Anglo-Saxonism, is defined by the people's ability to be orderly and independent, to be both, to be independent, but to be independent in an orderly fashion. And so it was only the Anglo-Saxon heredity which actually produced responsible citizens who would actually be able to responsibly practice democracy. So that's one of the roots of the political science discipline, this idea that the normal citizen or the competent citizen actually has a racial heredity, and that others do not have not inherited that ability to be both orderly and independent. And Herbert Baxter Adams was one of these people, and he was responsible for, you know, building this seminar series, which looked at, got students to look at local administration, to trace, you know, this heritage from the New England towns across the US. And of course, Woodrow Wilson was one of Adams' graduate students. And Wilson was very influenced, or at least in good part, influenced by another English guy called Walter Bajou. Walter Bajou, you guys might know, is was one of the famous first editors of The Economist magazine. But Walter Bajou was actually responsible. He wrote a book called Physics and Politics, which was and physics meaning biology. So he was actually the first person to introduce biology into the study of politics, right? And we can go into what that was, and it was it was horrendous and horrific. But anyway. And Woodrow Wilson followed on that. And so this idea that only Anglo-Saxons were capable of responsibly discharging their duties as citizens. And he took that to his presidency at Princeton, where he, you know, segregated there. And then he took it to the White House, where he segregated the executive branch. And then he took it to the League of Nations, where he saw the peace process after World War I as necessitating the development of an institution which would ensure the hegemony of the white races against the uprisings of the so-called coloured races, and that was his idea for the League of Nations. So all of this was being developed fin de siècle, you know, late 19th century, early 20th century. All of it was being developed against the backdrop of progressivism in the US, which was anything but that, and was basically a movement to preserve and to extend the good genes of Anglo-Saxonism insofar as they allowed for an orderly and independent citizenry against the immigration of Mexicans, First Nations peoples in Americas, Black freedom after the Civil War, and East European immigration. So we at Hopkins have a lot to contend with, right? And that's partly what we're also doing. So we're not just wanting to retrieve this racist genealogy of political science, but also posit something different. And we have a lot of people in our department historically who've been doing that. Jermaine Houston was one of the first scholar of color to get tenure at Hopkins, and she was in political science. Richard Eiton did his PhD at Hopkins, and he wrote this seminal book on Black politics and popular culture. Siba Gravogi introduced into international politics the idea that you could do African political thought. Michael Hanchard, very famous comparativist, and wrote stuff on Black political thought. And more recently, Veshla Weaver, who introduced policing as a serious subject of political science. Now, Lester Spencer, my colleague Lester Spencer and I, and it's really being driven by Lester, we're putting in place this project called The Rights to the City, specifically looking at Baltimore, a very historical and contemporarily segregated and inequitous place when it comes to race and class. And what we're trying to do is not just do a critique of inequity, but what we're trying to do is work with community organizations and activists to figure out what a critique and an analytical framework of rights to the city looks like from a Black perspective and a poor Black perspective, right? So what does it look like for those denizens who are being systematically denied any rights, and to whom municipalities and institutions are actually wrongdoers rather than right givers? And we're trying to build that from building a theory of politics from Black organizing, rather than from people like Woodrow Wilson, etc. And in that, we're also trying to develop, like many people are doing, an ethics and a methodology which allows for the co-cultivation of knowledge between academics and organizers and organizations, which includes a reparative element, some kind of reparative element. So that we're doing a lot more things, but I'll kind of stop in a second. But it's basically to say that an anti-racist political science would have to actively oppose the premise, which is often hidden, but it entirely reveals itself in ideas about ordinary subjects, ordinary citizens, and disorderly ones or degenerate ones. An anti-racist political science would have to actively oppose that premise and actually dig out and expose the way in which that premise is embedded in 19th century race science. And I would say we're still with that, to be honest. But it's also to actively build alternatives, and alternatives which are not in the future or imagination, but alternatives which have always existed and exist with us right now, so that we can build a plurality of repositories of grammars, ethics, and practices of politics. And that for us is the future of political science. I'll leave it there. Hopefully that's enough. I think I don't know. I roundabout addressed those questions, but I am a cat and you can't herd me. I'm sorry, Ingrid.
No, that was really, really good. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we have Derek up next.
Thank you, Ingrid. And nice to hear you talk about some of the colleagues at Johns Hopkins. There's some great scholars that I admire a great deal. Lester Spencer, as you mentioned, Nathan Connerly and Veshla Weaver, and now you, Robbie. And also gratitude to IGDC for taking on this issue at a time of Black history in the US, a recognition that these issues are global, and a shout out to colleagues across the pond. And let me just get into it. Across the globe and throughout history, extreme inequality has persisted, and in plain sight, racism, sexism, and other isms are strategically used to consolidate economic and political power for some at the expense of others. This is unjust, this is immoral, and this is all about power relationships. Understanding the persistence of extreme inequality and the pivotal roles of race and other group identities, such as one's gender, disability status, sexual orientation, and forging our political alignments and economic divisions, that should be core to the mission that we have as economists and academics in general. This global pandemic reveals a collective public health and economic vulnerability of a system that actively produces inequality. In a just world, race, gender, ethnicity, and nativity they would have no transactional value as it relates to material, psychological, or security outcomes. It is overly evident that certain identity groups face greater vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities result from unjust historical as well as contemporary social stratifications. The racially disparate treatment by our law enforcement in the US, as well as health and economic exposure differentials to a pandemic linked to a larger political and economic vulnerability for Black Americans, as well as Latinx, Indigenous, and other people of color, whether we are in a pandemic or not. The immoral devaluation of Black lives has been ingrained in the American political economy, and it is long overdue for reckoning. We need a deeper understanding of how devaluing individuals based on one's social identity relate to political notions of who is deserving and who is undeserving, and understanding that is essential to expand our knowledge beyond the conceptions of, as economists think of it, individual transactions, and to better understand how those political notions lead to a larger political economy structure that affects us all. In other words, policy interventions themselves are endogenous. The structures of our political economy and race go beyond class and individual bigotry. As a matter of course, across America and the global institutional landscape in general, race and social identity in general, here's a key point, they're strategically used to generate hierarchy and propel systems of stratification and persistent inequality. We do not have adequate social safety net in place. What we have in the US is over 5 decades of deregulation and a market revolution that has been supported by a neoliberal vision of supply side economics under the lure that the structures and government subsidies that benefit corporate interests, the so-called job creators, that this is supposed to generate a market dynamism of economic activity that's supposed to lift all boats and trickle down to us all. That trickle down has never been realized over the last 50 years. Still, our contemporary political economy radically situates a proverbial market as a great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our worth and the solution for all our problems, economic or otherwise. The orthodoxy of economics is based on a dogma, a faith that markets are somehow natural, transparent, efficient, and inevitable. This belief does not give enough credence to the political actions that form and codify markets in the first place. Instead, the presumption that markets are simply natural, it leads to a false notion of fairness that somehow if each individual is free to pursue their own profit motives and happiness, then this will ultimately lead to the greater good for society. Markets, whether they're product markets, labor markets, financial markets, they're presumed to be self-regulating in the sense that the most astute, the most valued, and the hardest worker, they're believed to prosper and endure, while the least astute, the least valued, the laziest, they're presumed to receive their just rewards and simply fade away and have to do something else over time. The problem with these presumptions is they pay little attention to the roles of power and endowment or capital, and how power and capital can adjust and alter the rules of structure and markets to privilege that power and capital in the first place. Without capital and without power, inequality is locked in. We use words like choice and freedom to describe the so-called benefits of a market, but choice is an illusion if an individual lacks basic needs like a job, adequate income, shelter, food, or health care. It is literally wealth that gives us choice, freedom, and optionality. Economic freedom and authentic agency is rooted in capital, resources, and ultimately power. Economists should do a better job of understanding the political economy, including these power and endowment relationships, and be more keenly focused on understanding and advocating structures that lead to truly equitable and fair distributions. Without such an analysis, we are culpable. My profession is complicit in the continued trajectory towards stratification both within and across nation state. As a result, it's not surprising that we have a paucity of students from subaltern backgrounds entering fields like economics. Ultimately, these explanations of persistent racial discrimination typically reduce to some collective group-based human capital or cultural ineptitude or dysfunction on the part of Blacks, on the part of Latinx, and on the part of other subaltern group members as the explanation for these inequalities. Without a doubt, education is positively associated with better economic outcomes for all people, including Americans. However, racial disparity in economic outcomes not only persist, they worsen at higher levels of education. We have overstated the functional roles of education to the detriment of understanding the functional roles of power and wealth. Also, the economics profession has fallen short in our understanding of the role of group-based identities, identities like race, gender, and their intersections, particularly as they relate to material and psychological well-being. The conventional view is that group identity and prejudice, they're exogenously determined binaries, and they represent some preference, some taste, some bigotry, or some ignorance that should be arbitraged away by non-bigoted, profit-seeking, efficient firms. It ignores the strategic agency and benefits that individuals have in choosing and investing in their collective group identities, and how social structures may increase or decrease the value and incentives associated with that identity. In other words, I'm talking about white privilege. But let me take a quick tangent to talk about intersectionality. And I'm talking about it in large response to a fairly recent popular study by Rod Chetty, which looked at intergenerational transfers and looked at intergenerational social mobility and found that there was downward mobility for Black men, but compared to white women, not Black women. And they concluded that there's a unique set of challenges for Black men. But Black men and women are not so neatly separable from each other. There's nuanced intergenerational household and structural effects that economists need to better account. We do not live in a vacuum that neatly separates us. The simple comparison of Black women's wages to white women's wages does not disentangle the impact of race and gender from economic outcomes and lived experience. We know Becky Pettit's study on invisible men emphasizes that labor market studies exclude incarcerated individuals who are grossly and disproportionately Black men. A negative spillover and intersectional effect of mass incarceration is the fact that rather than being a source of resource for households, Black men in prison further drain household budgets. Compounding this situation, there's a growing share of incarcerated Black women relative to white women. In our patriarchal society, it is unreasonable to separate Black and white women from their larger familial and social context. The structural racism identified by Chetty et al., it vividly illustrates that even when affluent class backgrounds, Black men have much lower employment rates, lower incomes, and 10 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white men. But the precarious economic position of Black men, combined with a rigid interracial marriage market in which Black women are the least likely demographic to intermarry, it results in a pool of eligible spouses that of a dramatically smaller, far fewer economic resources than their white women counterparts. The outcome is that Black women tend to face greater familial, financial, and caregiving responsibilities. But more broadly, the fact that Blacks who live in families where the head graduated from college typically have less wealth than whites where the family dropped out of high school, the fact that a Black expectant mother with a college degree has a greater likelihood of an infant death than a white expectant mother who dropped out of high school, and the fact that a Black man with a college degree is nearly 3 times more likely to die from a stroke than a white man who dropped out of high school, these are all indicative of property rights and whiteness. We need theoretical and empirical approaches that challenge and expand the conventional orthodox economic view that human capital attainment and inequality, and examine how social identity formations and collective actions, how they relate to preserving social hierarchy and economic outcomes. We need to understand how markets themselves may be exploited to actually reinforce inequality. We need to better understand how race prejudice itself constitutes a defensive reaction, a protective mechanism that serves a purpose of preserving social hierarchy enhancing the relative position of a dominant group. To conclude, the good news is that change may be happening. For instance, we've been witnessing across all 50 US states and pretty much the entire globe, civil protesters shouting with solidarity that Black Lives Matter. Younger generations and social movements may be beginning to redefine economic good to embrace the principles of morality, common humanity, and sustainability. These values are a necessary ingredient if we're ever going to have an authentic coalition across race, gender, sexual orientation to address our common paradigms of growing inequality. I do know that without a potent policy alternative to the neoliberal vision that's been presented, we need that potent policy alternative grounded in economic justice. Racist regimes will not be neutered. We need to have a pathway to economic security, self-determination for all people. White supremacy and the despotic political appeal for divisive leadership will remain without that potent policy alternative. I encourage us all to commit to justice as a matter of faith, just as the economic discipline has committed to markets as a matter of faith. We need to reimagine fair and efficient distributions and again, commit to justice as a matter of faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really great. So next we have Rhonda Sharp.
Thank you. I was supposed to go before Derek, and I elected to go after Derek because my comments I knew would be very different. So I want to start by saying, for me, the timeliness of this conversation is spot on, and echo Derek and thanking the Interdisciplinary Global Development Center for having this conversation. It seems to me that many of our colleagues in Great Britain are holding such panels to have a conversation about anti-racism and how do we think about bringing race into conversations in ways that I'm not quite seeing in the US. But that said, one of the things that has me excited and yet a little annoyed is a tweet in which Nina Banks tweeted out yesterday that the Center on the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession has put together a list that talks about women in economics. And Nina's quote, and I'm going to read her quote, says, "Oh, how I wish that someone would let the authors know that Black women are also women. The list includes History of Women in Economics, but not Julianne Malveau's seminal article on Sadie Alexander and econ. They're also missing, and what Nina didn't put was not just Julianne's seminal work, but also her efforts around Sadie Alexander, and I'll come to that later, or the work that I have done talking about Black women and economics. So as I think about these conversations, I think about them more in terms of where the scholarship conversation. As the co-editor for the review of Black political economy, I have been annoyed, borderline angry about the conversation that centers on the top journals and the percentage of articles that they produce on race. And what that conversation does is it devalues the work that is in the review of Black political economy, which is over 50 years old, and the first journal that was established to provide a space for, in particular, Black economists to publish work. So when we talk about what are the problems in the professions, I think that's one of them. I find that the work in the review of Black political economy often pushes the envelope. Derek and Sandy Darity's paper on baby bonds was published in the review of Black political economy. Also there's a whole special issue on stratification that's published in the review of Black political economy, yet many scholars won't cite the work that's published in the Review of Black Political Economy. I have a paper with Cecilia Conrad that looks at the Prop 209, which is California's anti-affirmative action policy, was first published in the Review of Black Political Economy. People don't cite our work. So I think as we talk about race and we talk about the problems, much of this starts with what's considered good scholarship, who are we citing, and the consequences of that is it will encourage or discourage the next generation of scholars, especially those who are interested in coming in academic spaces, because citations greatly influence tenure. So having said that, I want to talk about what I find that's most interesting that's going on right now. And I'm going to come back to Nina Banks. I am going to focus a good deal of my conversation on the space of Black women, because I do think that there's a great deal of erasure that happens for Black women and economics that isn't just about whether or not topics discuss us, but it's also in the ways in which people listen to us. They provide us a space to speak. They elevate what we say, and whether or not they actually think about doing research that centers on us. Janelle Jones, who is the current chief economist at the Department of Labor, has a saying where she says Black women best, i.e., if you center on Black women, then you get policies that are good for all. So it's really exciting to see Janelle be at the Department of Labor, where she'll be able to put a good deal of that into practice. But I'm going to come back to Nina. Nina has a book that will come out on June 15th, which will be the 100th anniversary of Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander receiving her doctorate in economics. And why I think that this work is incredibly important is because it'll be an edited volume of her speeches. And what you will see in these speeches is, even though Sadie practiced, and I'm gonna put that in quotations, as a lawyer, she was a practicing lawyer, the assumption is that somehow when she became a lawyer, economics was no longer part of the theory or the underlying, like somehow she was no longer an economist. And what Nina's edited volume will show is economics is very much an underlying theme in the work that she does. And so that even though she wasn't an economist, she was a practicing lawyer, she was very much an economist. So I think it's going to bring back to this question about who and what does it mean to be an economist. The second thing that I find is interesting is my work, the work that I do around the production of Black women in an economic space. I pointed out in my 2018 National Economic Association presidential address the lack of Black women who were studying economics at the undergraduate degree. At the undergraduate level, that has huge implications for the pipeline at the doctorate level. And then third, the thing that I think is most exciting is this field around stratification economics, in which folks like Sandy Darity, Derek, Jim Stewart, Cruz Bruno, all doing an enormous amount of work in this space, as well as Dania Franks. I think that those are the topics that are most interesting to me. Now, to move on to what I think the obstacles are, I think the obstacles are what we say when people have a problem or addiction. You've got to acknowledge that there's a problem. And I don't think that econ has acknowledged that they are biased. Derek talked about power and agency. Nina and I had a conversation prior to this panel in which we were talking about what people mean when they say women, how we erase folks when we use the term women and minorities. And what I find with my work at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, in which we're trying to expand women's focused research to focus on Asian, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous American, and multiracial women, is that I get the biggest pushback from white women who don't seem to be willing to recognize also something that Derek said, their white privilege and the ways in which they are complicit in oppressing other women. So having said that, what do I think needs to be done? I think the biggest thing is for folks to be mindful of the words that they use and how that language excludes. When the focus is on top journals, it implicit in that statement is work published elsewhere is not good quality or worthy to be cited. So we need to make sure that our colleagues, when they're doing work in the race space, at the intersection of race and gender, that they have done their homework, that their literature review is solid, that they are citing those who come before them. And then I think the other part is in this conversation around diversity and inclusion, which I've probably been saying 4 or 5 years now, we have this conversation as if the definition is a universal one, and it is not. I can tell you when I talk to Black people about diversity and inclusion, what we're looking to see is that our representation is moving. When you talk to women, and women in quotation marks, you know, in the aggregate, they're looking to see women move. So in order to have things different, we have to define first what it means to be biased and what it looks like, what we mean when we say diversity and inclusion, and then finally hold folks accountable for not being intentional in their lit review and the ways in which they cite work that has already been done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really good. So there are so many things that we could follow up on here and so many rich discussions to have. And I know the audience feels the same because they're already starting to put questions into the Q&A box. So I think, so to the audience members, keep putting your questions in, and you can also vote for the ones that you want answered. But before we go to the Q&A box, I just wanted to ask all of the 3 panelists a question, because you've outlined really well, you know, some of the problems, some of the implications of those problems, some of the things that can be done. But then it would be really interesting to hear from each of you how you approach race and racism in your work in politics and in economics. I think the audience would also really want to hear more about that. So let's just go around in the same order. So we can start with Robbie.
Well, I think, for me, I think there's two elements to it, right? And it links to what I was talking about in terms of a critique of the racist premises of political science as a field of study and taking those apart. But it also pertains to retrieving and critically reconstructing all the other traditions of thinking about politics, which never were based on those premises and actually produce insightful and edifying knowledge already. Yeah, and I think both of those things are really important for me. Yeah, so so if I'm thinking about, say, Blackness, then I would say that, you know, racism is what produces Blackness, but but Blackness as a response to that doesn't owe to the imposition, right? So there's a different set of premises and starting points for the response, even if it shares in some of the language of the imposition. And I think that's very, very important, because the critique is really, really crucial, but but the critique itself does a silencing act, right? Because, you know, like I think someone in the Q&A said, who's the dude? There's a guy called who was saying, you know, orderly independence is the Anglo-Saxon heredity. Let me because it's a French name, right? So hold on, let me just put it in the thingy. So is that guy, Walter Baju, who still, I mean, there's the current affairs column in The Economist is still called after him, right? And he's the guy who introduced biological racism into the study of politics, right? And he had ideas about how habit was a expression of the will, which led to, over time, the Anglo-Saxon brain being smoothed, and so that it could, its crevices smoothed out so that it could think rationally, and then contemporary savages, what he called them, have deep incisions into their brain still, in which is held, all the irrationalities and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's Baju, but what I'm saying is there's plenty of other people who didn't start with their premise about politics on that. Do you get what I mean? And we need to do that too. So I see that double task also very much in terms of what Rhonda was saying about citations, right? But expanded even further to say that, why don't we seriously consider fora which don't have academic credentials, which are community-based fora? Why don't we see them as, in principle, critical and edifying sites of knowledge production? Do you see what I mean? I'm struck by, we've been doing a bit of stuff with the Walter Rodney Foundation at Hopkins last year, and I'm struck by the way in which Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is an incisive critique of modernization theory, right? Economic development, which is a staple still today, right? It's an incisive critique, but it's made at Dar es Salaam University in Tanzania. It's not written for academics, but it's an academic writing it. Do you get what I mean? But it's dismissed so much because it's seen as, oh, that's just a populist piece of work. But it's based on real, proper research, and it remains an incredibly incisive critique of some of the premises of economics and political economy. Right. So, starting with this idea that there's a twofold thing about race: the critique of racism, right, but the retrieval, right, the retrieval of anti-racist traditions of thought. Both of those things have to go on, and that speaks to the broader politics of the university in terms of its relationship with the communities that surround it, near and far, right, and how to reorient that relationship away from an old theocratic model that it's the church and the priests, who rule paternalistically over all the denizens, which is what the university model is based upon, to something much more horizontal and reparative.
Thank you. Derek, would you like to talk about how you approach race and racism in your work?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to make 3 points and try to do it fairly brief, and that is, a discipline that's accused of being hyper-rational, it's really problematic that we don't really have a theory of identity, race, and stratification writ large beyond just some exogenous bigotry based on taste. That's a problem. So, I try to understand the investments that people are incentivized to have in one's identity and how that intertwines with our larger economic structure from a strategic standpoint, and trying to come up with alternatives that disincentivize immoral investments. Again, I'm not for getting rid of race and ridding one of one's identity, or getting rid of gender. People should celebrate these things. The problem is that they have material, psychological, and political consequences. And there's a reason why. To think that it's just based on bigotry and should be arbitraged away, that's a problem. The second point is the inseparable and interrelated effects of economics, politics. That's known. I think people have thought about that for a long time. But what's not known is this third adage, which is race or stratification, the role that identity plays. That identity is a pillar in that relationship. The ability for Donald Trump to have as his signature policy a tax cut for the wealthy, but still garner 70 million votes in the American context, had everything to do with race. And we do a disservice and a misunderstanding if our scholarship doesn't understand that as despair grew in America, Donald Trump was able to capitalize on that despair by codifying the privileges and whiteness, saying, I'm going to build walls to keep Mexicans out. saying that, law and order, we know all the tropes, but that's important and critical. And likewise, we need solutions that recognize that if we're going to combat it. The last thing I'll say is, and it's related to some of the questions in the chat, which is, what is the role of the academy? And I won't answer it completely. I'll just say that our current academic structures are incentivized to not be intersectional, but to demonstrate why they themselves have the answers, particularly economics, because it has grown to be the hegemonic discipline in the academy. And that's not a coincidence either. I think Nancy McLean's book explains that to a large extent. But there's an incentive for economists not to emphasize interdisciplinary work, to show why they themselves have all the answers, and that's problematic. And other thing I'll say is that we as academics, particularly the ones protected by a system of tenure, which offers them a job without the threat of unemployment, have a moral obligation to take risk and to do scholarship related to social mobility, investments in human flourishing, etc., because we get large tax subsidies as well as that protectionism with regards to our job.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Rhonda.
So as I tell people, I'm a recovering academic. So I was an academic for 18 years, did the unthinkable in terms of gave up tenure, and then found that this was not a space that really had an interest in me. So what I did was I started the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, which is the first research think tank to focus solely on Asian, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous American, and multiracial women. So in my work, this is front and center. In my role at the Review of Black Political Economy, what I do is promote the scholarship of others. And so if you haven't seen the article, a very lovely write-up on Nina Banks in the New York Times, it shows exactly the kind of work that we do. So that's what I sort of do more broadly. But in my everyday research, the thing that I realize I have always done, even in my dissertation, and that is I have always disaggregated data. My dissertation, which was focused on mathematical finance, showed by race and gender and educational attainment how this would be used. And what I advocate now is unlike the UN, which says they want sex disaggregated data. I want us to disaggregate data by the characteristics that we believe influence an outcome. I think that in doing that, and it is the work that we do at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, that you get what Derek sort of alluded to in his previous comments about the nuances between Black men and Black women, but you also get the nuances in a variety of other groups that allow you to target policies so that you can get the intended outcomes. I have also been bringing a great deal of attention to when people don't disaggregate data and how that logic is very flawed. So that is the way that I actually, I think I've always disaggregated by race and gender, because I think it's incredibly important that we see ourselves in the data. And I think that's what most people, you want to read a study and see you and not see yourself always from a deficit lens. And that's the work that I do. Try not to other and not to use a deficit lens when I am talking about Asian, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous American, and multiracial women.
So considering that we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, I think what we'll do is we'll go to some of those, and they keep coming in, because I think every time, you've been answering Ingrid's questions, there's been more and more thoughts in people's minds. So highlighting how fascinating your summaries were. So we have a couple of questions that are all about the role of universities in both reproducing inequalities, but also what role it can do in order to one of the participants called Create a More Level Playing Field. And Derek, just in your response to Ingrid, you already highlighted some of that when you said, for example, that tenured professors should actually be the ones taking the risk and do some of this work. So I think, you know, what I'll do as well is ask each one of you what your reflections are on this, because we've been talking here about disciplines and departments, but departments sit within a university, and that sits within in a larger structure about higher education and so on. But you know, following on in the same order, then again, starting with Robbie, what do you think about, you know, the role of the universities in having brought about or helping reinforce these inequalities, but also what it can do next? And you've already mentioned that fascinating project in your own university, or at least in your department, and about, you know, moving and engaging with local communities. But what's your view on that?
Yeah, so the role of universities in reproducing inequalities, right?
Yeah, well, particularly around race and ethnicity, but you know, back to the intersectionality aspect of it, you can't bracket it all.
Well, I think there is a professional element of this. I don't know if professional is quite the right word, but it's more to do with even the idea of a craft, right? Which is that university posits itself as being the space which can best and most adequately address questions about the problems that other people have. Right, it took over from the church, right? Now, in that is an assumption that poor communities especially, right, and those are, and obviously we have the intersectionality within the poor community, you know, like where does the burden fall on, and that's a gendered and a raced one as well, and a generational one as well, right? But the idea is that these communities cannot or cannot potentially even have knowledge systems which provide answers to the problems that they experience, right? That's the university's job. So the first thing is an epistemological imposition that universities have, which is very much tied to the craft and to the institution itself. And that's a very difficult thing for us to get around, because, you know, as Rhonda was saying, you know, there's a whole set of hierarchies which are already raced and gendered and nationalized, which point to, you know, who does produce valid knowledge, yeah? So the first thing is that, and it's a very foundational one, and it's very difficult to address. And you know, it is often somewhat problematically presents when you know, superstar academics sometimes even if it's not to their intentions, you know, it's in media tend to replace the voices and the knowledges of the peoples who are actually being subjugated, who might have their own peeps and representatives and knowledge systems, right? So that's the first thing. That links intrinsically to, and here I'm especially thinking about universities placed in towns and cities. It links intrinsically to the grab for land that universities are almost always involved in, right? And that is not necessarily a kind of like private real estate thing, but it's to do with the fact that universities, if they're, for example, non-profit, they usually churn their money back into building, right? And building these land, and what do you do with the people who are on the land already? And then when you build more land and you have more, you compete for more resources for the students so that they can be happy and you can attract more students. What happens is all the prices in the area tend to go up, right? So there is a very material issue to do with the epistemological thing, which I was saying, which is about, you know, be the best university, attract the best talent, actually almost always leads to land grabs, right? And in various different ways, in very mediated ways often, and that's often to the detriment of the peoples who the university is supposed to most immediately serve. So it perpetuates itself.
Derek, do you want to add anything further to your earlier point, or maybe respond to Robbie?
Yes, you know, the earlier point, just amplify it, that universities get so much public subsidy, they get so much privilege, and they have not just a moral, a social responsibility to give back. That's one thing, front and center. The second point is, somebody asked a question about in the chat about my invoking the word justice and saying that we need to commit to justice as a matter of faith. You know, what I mean by that is just that when some people pose questions to me of, you got all these ideas, are they realistic? Do you think they're going to happen? That doesn't deter me. I'm committed to it as a matter of faith because it's the right thing to do. That in and of itself is enough. And that's what I'm encouraging people to do, that we can come up with arguments and justifications why equity could be good, and they may or may not, they're context specific. You know, when people say equity is good for growth, well, slavery can grow an economy. The slave trade led to the Industrial Revolution, but that doesn't mean we should do it. So that's why I'm saying we should commit to it regardless, because it's the right thing to do. It's humanistic. And then, you know, let me say a couple other things. There's no such thing as a strictly positivist endeavor. And this is another wool that my discipline has pulled over the eyes of society, that economics is somehow natural, grounded in science. The two welfare theorems of economics are normative. Defining value in terms of growth is normative. We can define economic value how we choose. Those are political choices. Common humanity is an economic outcome that we can define. So you know, it's important to know that all academic endeavors start with some norms. I think we should just be more upfront and name them, and I am. I'm committed to justice as a matter of faith. Those are my principles that I come to this endeavor with. And if that's biased, I'm biased. Let me say the last thing about the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the new school that we're starting up. And this is a little self-serving because it's a plug. Our modus operandi for scholarship production is threefold. One, we begin with research. To me, that's the truth-seeking stage. That's understanding rigor. That's applying rigor to understand relationships, aesthetics, etc. We don't own the truth, but we're seeking the truth. And that's what we start with. That's our foundation. But it's not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge creation. We apply that knowledge. There's a second phase, which is application to promote human flourishing. That's what we want to do. We want to improve the human condition. So there's an application stage, and then finally a public engagement stage. There's an obligation for the academy to publicly engage, as Robbie alluded to, or not alluded, he said it, as Robbie said. There's an obligation for us to learn from others, to challenge what we do, to make it applicable, to forge social movement, to provide the resource, I don't want to be paternalistic, to provide and facilitate advocacy, agency, public policy, etc., and also to learn that we might have been wrong. And then that iterates right back to the research stage, and we keep going.
Okay. Rhonda.
So I'm going to take a different approach, because it seems to me that we've been talking about the university in the abstract. And the reality is the university are the folks who work there, right? It is not this abstract being. So when we talk about the obligation of the university, I think it first starts with the faculty. And I've written about this in econ, and I'm sure econ is not alone in the ways in which we replicate, right? That we're coming into the space to replicate who we are. So as Derek is talking about taking risk because you have tenure, so much of what we see is that And he knows this because we both have been the associate director for the diversity initiative for tenure in economics. And one of the things that Sandy Darity would always say is that his experiences, whatever the work that people did before they got tenure and their attitudes and their approach is the same on the other side of tenure. So, many times folks put their head down, they do the work that they need to do to get tenure, but they don't change that on the other side. Like it is rare that you really see people become more vocal. So I think as we're talking about the university, what we really need to be doing is talking about and thinking, looking at who our colleagues are, what's their moral compass in terms of the work that we do, what do departments advertise in terms of opportunity and knowledge? Is that shared broadly, or is it only shared with students that they deem to be worthy of that information because they've made a decision about what's going to be there next? Someone asked about prestige and how do you handle prestige? I'm going to say again, that's back on us. I said to a Wall Street Journal reporter when she was writing an article about Black scholarship and was very disappointed that my comment as the co-editor didn't make it. And I'm going to stand on this. And, Derek talks about justice. I stand on the fact that, take a good look in the mirror and figure out what you're doing. I am not a fan of implicit bias because I don't think most of us are going to be willing to call out our colleagues, and not because we don't see what they do is wrong, but because there are consequences. There are major consequences to holding folks accountable, and most of us don't want to do that. So in terms of prestige, I think it's for us to ask ourselves, how do we perpetuate prestige? How do we perpetuate whose work is being cited? Gregory Price has joined me as co-editor of the Review of Black Political Economy. And it's been wonderful because one of the things Greg always says to me is, as the editor, right, you have the editor's prerogative. You submit an article to the Review of Black Political Economy and you're not citing our work, then we can very well tell you when it comes back, we better see some citations out of the Review of Black Political Economy. Like nobody would do that in any other journal, think about submitting. So I think when we're talking about prestige, when we're talking about justice, when we're talking about the university, we have to remember that that's us. We perpetuate all of the things that we're talking about stopping. And so we want that to stop. Michael Jackson said it best. I'm starting in this case with the woman in the mirror. And I think that's the key, right? What are you doing?
So I think that relates to a lot of the questions that a lot of the attendees have asked, which is about something practical that they can do. And Rhonda, what you're suggesting is when we are writing, thinking about who we're citing, but also thinking about where we're sending it to. You were saying earlier on, the top journals are always cited, like, they don't pay attention to race, but then there's this whole lot of journals that do pay attention to race and they're just not being heard, they're not being out there. So there's something very practical, I think, for those of us who work in higher education to do. Any other practical things perhaps that you want to suggest that, and we also have quite a few students in the Q&A as well, graduate students, but also undergraduate students. So what are the things that staff, students in higher education can do to address some of these issues, to decolonize, to bring things out, the inequalities and how these inequalities work and how they've worked for a very long time and being perpetuated, and how we ourselves are part and parcel of some of that. So anything practical that,
I'll chime in on that. Greg Price and I have published about this, and we have often talked about, Derek mentioned the funding. Robbie has talked about how higher ed are nonprofits and what they do with those profits, right? They reinvest them. We see them in endowments. We see them in what should be scholarships, et cetera. But we have advocated for when you see bad behavior happening, then funding institutions should stop providing the funding, right? Like they always tell us to follow the money, right? Like you want to know what's going on, follow the money. Well, you can get change to happen when you withhold purse strings. For the students who are listening, I'm going to share a real quick personal story. As someone who is in interdisciplinary and econ and mathematics, For me in math, there was no conversation about race or gender, right? You just got an answer. And when I came to econ, one of the hardest things for me was this realization, this realization that now, 3 wasn't 3, but 3, the value was of 3 depending on who had it. So now I had to think about, was Susie Black? Was she white? Is she married? Does she have children? Where does she live? And I had a conversation with Cecilia Conrad, who was my dissertation advisor, about doing work on race. Because I said to her, I didn't want to be the economist who was seen as, doing work on Black people. And she said to me, it won't matter. People will assume that anyway. And because of who I am, I was like, she don't know. Then I did my postdoc at UNC Chapel Hill, and I was there to work with Ron Gallant. But because Sandy Darity was in the department, people always assumed that I worked with Sandy, and it didn't matter what color they were on campus. They were like, oh, you're in econ, are you working with Sandy? And I was like, no. And then I was like, yeah, right? Because clearly nobody was giving me an opportunity to work anyplace else. So I say that to say that when you do work on race, you really have to surround yourself with people who are going to be supportive of your work, right? And I think that's the part that we forget. There is a whole large community that was welcoming you, that wants you to join them in their scholarship. And I strongly encourage you to seek them out. The National Economics Association is one of those spaces. International Association for Feminist Economists is another space. So seek us out. We want to be supportive of your work. We want to elevate it. And at the Review of Black Political Economy, and there is also the Journal of Economics, Race, and Policy are 2 spaces we want to publish your work.
Okay. Anything, Derek, you want to add anything?
I'm going to speak more global. I'm ready for system change. I think we have a long history of seeing how this structure and system has operated. The accumulation of economic and political power at the top for some, at the expense of others, and the use of various identities by which to divide us and keep us separated, rather than using collective power to lead to a more values-based system. So the advice I'm going to give is, again, more global and not specific, but commit to collective action, commit to collective power, and do so in a way that redefines value in humanistic terms. Recognize, and this is not pie in the sky, recognize the common humanity in us, recognize the need for sustainability, commit to that, right? The greatest threats to systems have often come from clergy community when they started to recognize that economics is not the explicit domain of the economists, but there's a moral imperative to our economics and our political economy writ large. So my advice is, through collective action, through redefining values, it is our economy, it is our monetary systems, and these are our governments. Reclaim them and redesign systems so that we can achieve the societies that we deserve.
The title of our webinar today is Racist Disciplines ? And that made me wonder, because we've got economics, we've got political science, there's a lot of other disciplines out there. Are there perhaps disciplines that you feel are trying to grapple with some of these issues in a better way, who are perhaps through their learned society doing a lot of work that other disciplines actually could maybe learn something from, who you feel they're grappling with it better than my own discipline?
I'll go first this time, if that's okay. And I'll try to be brief. Critical race theory, there's some scholarship amongst the legal profession, but as Rhonda pointed out, oftentimes they're led by cadres of individuals within certain disciplines and it's not limited to critical race theory. There's some in economics, some in politics. So I think that there are incubations of this, but perhaps the best person who I've seen who's put forth an interdisciplinary approach of why we need to have an interdisciplinary lens to understand race and power is Jim Stewart. Jim Stewart has an article, I forget the name of it, but I'll try to summarize the point, which is, if we're trying to understand phenomena with a contemporary analytical lens that's ahistoric, that's problematic. And if we understand problems from a historical or aesthetic lens without some of the contemporary analytical toolkits, that's also problematic. It is the fusing of them together, the aesthetics, history, as well as some of our analytical approaches that might come out of some of the social sciences. And then we can add even the professionals. It is through this that we're better able to understand these problems. And to make it clear and concrete, think about the racial wealth gap. If you were to just look at the racial wealth gap and look at that huge disparity that exists, basically in the US, and I'm sure the Great Britain context is no different, a 10-to-1 difference, you would assume, what is wrong with Black people? Why is it that they, and then if you look and see, well, they have all these subprime loans. Why are they getting all these subprime loans? Of course, if you were to understand the way in which wealth is generated, it is wealth that begets more wealth. It is wealth that allows you to get access to better financial products. And it is lack of wealth that leaves you vulnerable to predatory financial products. And that long history of public policy that enabled white wealth while excluding Black wealth, and when Blacks were able to accumulate wealth, it was politically vulnerable to terror, predation, etc. The 100th year anniversary of the Tulsa massacre is about to occur. So whatever pockets Black people have gotten of wealth in the United States have often been politically vulnerable. Without that understanding and history, as well as an analytical lens today of how to intervene to ultimately change that previous narrative, you're incomplete.
Thank you. You're summarizing almost the thinking behind our center, because our thinking is you've got major global challenges, problems, and you can't solve them from one discipline. You need always to have multiple disciplines coming together to address them. Robbie, Rhonda, any views from you on whether you think some disciplines are doing a better job?
Well, I mean, I would say it's not so much what disciplines, but it's where the scholarship's happening, actually. So I'd say it's less interdisciplinary, but more in terms of location of scholarship. So, I mean, like in the UK, Black history was developed as a field of study by Black communities, not by university. And then it came into the university afterwards. Right? I mean, it's really simple. Yeah. So we need to think about the location, right? But also location in terms of geographical. So there's plenty of places in the world where these kind of conversations are well established and have been going on for decades. My 5 years in New Zealand, I used to hang out with some of the people doing Māori studies, the indigenous people, New Zealand, and the rest of the university thought that Māori studies was either anthropology or languages, but Māori studies saw themselves as a university within a university, with a premise that colonialism happened and it was bad, that and with another premise that any issue in the world from science to humanities could be in principle be usefully addressed by Māori knowledge systems, right? So it's the location for me rather than the interdisciplinary, because whilst that's important, you speak to anthropologists and they'll go on for hours about how terrible anthropology is, but anthropology started this stuff way before most of the other social sciences, right? But they'll still say, what I mean? Do you get what I mean? So every field is always saying it's the worst and there's other fields which are better. You get what I'm saying? For me, it's the location and the interconnection of the locations, both in terms of university systems globally, but also in terms of where the knowledge is being cultivated.
Okay, Rhonda.
I think for me, it's education, and it may be the way in which the doctorate in education is structured, where they generally have some other area that they're already looking at. And I say education because they have long talked about race. They are the discipline that if you Google disaggregating data, you will see them having a conversation about the disaggregation of data. I think education has long understood the interplay between race, sex, and I should say gender more broadly than sex, income, location. I think they have long understood that. Now, having said that, I also think that what Derek and what we all have been saying about location, and I'm going to make that location again, as Greg often says, by fancy address, are the folks who really get to push policies, push policy forward. I will say, and this is again my bias, I think the space that I'm most excited to see really grapple with this conversation is economics, because of the influence of economic policy in so many spaces of our lives. Now, I don't say that to say that is going well, but I am enjoying seeing people grapple with the conversation. I think it reminds me not only of the work that's left to be done, but it also reminds me that there are people who are listening and who want change, right? And so that's I think education, and then I'm most excited to see econ have this conversation because of the consequences.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also trying to build a question based on some of the ones in the Q&A box. And I think what would be really interesting to hear from you based on some of these questions is, and this is building a little bit on what Robbie already mentioned a bit, because there's this movement to decolonize economics and politics and the social sciences. And there were some questions about decolonizing the curriculum. Oh. And then there's the anti-racist movements in these disciplines as well, and more broadly. So, of course, these movements are often interlinked, but there are also differences between them. So it will be interesting to hear, especially from Robbie, since he's writing a book on this. So is this movement to decolonize politics or decolonize economics enough to tackle racism as well? Is it necessary? What are the differences and sort of gaps between these? And how do we sort of approach them together?
Yeah. So I mean, I think the geography of it is important. No, you can't have that. Just wait a minute. Just have patience. I sound like economist now. Just have patience. It'll all trickle down. But anyway, so I'd say in the US, Black Studies has been doing this from year dot, right? So. The decolonizing thing, I think, is probably more embedded in the UK thing, simply because of the Commonwealth history of the UK. UK was heart of an empire, right? Now, US does become heart of another empire, right? But it's also a settler colony, right? And that makes a difference in terms of how people understand these things, and even in terms of how the university systems deal with them. So, there's incredible inequity in the US system, as Derek and especially Rhonda have been talking about, right? But there is an acknowledgement, even if it might be taken back, or even if it might be diminished, that there are certain things to do with the genesis of the US, which were to do with race, right? Even the fact that, you had the 1619 project, I don't know if you guys in the UK saw this, but it created a response from the White House. I mean, from Trump's White House. It was so alarming to people, right? I can't imagine that in the UK, right? So there's a certain intimacy. Now in the UK, what you have is you have a similar thing, but it's mediated by the idea that Britain was an island which was separate from its colonies, and that all the crazy rubbish happened in the colonies, and that Britain remained rational and reasonable and all that kind of stuff. So you have a white purity at the heart of Britain's higher cultural institutions, including academia, whereby it's just rude to talk about race. It's just rude. Do you see what I mean? And that if you did want to talk about it, you wouldn't talk about race, you'd talk about India, or you talk about the Caribbean, or you're certainly talking about South Africa and the US, or the crazy people doing the crazy stuff over there. Do you get what I mean? So there is a certain geography, to do with empire itself, which actually refracts into how these issues are dealt with in particular kind of university ecosystems, right? So I think, just to put it just even more bluntly, roll back a little bit from the keyword. Don't search for the keyword. Look at the grammar. What's the grammar doing? And I think you'll find that the grammar is quite similar in a lot of these places, right? Do you know what I mean? So now that's not to say there aren't a lot of decolonizing stuff which don't really do race, but just because someone says they're doing anti-racist work doesn't mean that's not decolonizing. In the US, it cannot but be, and it's not that that's the only thing, but it cannot but be. Do you see what I mean? So let's think about the grammars and have a dialogue about the grammars rather than just search for the Google keywords.
Derek and Rhonda, is there anything you'd like to add to that? Or
I mean, I'll build on it and say that Trump used the 1619 project as a political football. So he was strategic. And that leads to the point that I'm interpreting from Robbie, which is scholarship is weaponized. It's weaponized in a lot of ways. And he Trump is an example of that weaponization. And, anybody who interested in additional scholarship on this, I highly recommend Nancy McLean's book. What is it? Democracy and Change, which describes the evolution of a discipline with intentionality to promote a certain type of political economy.
I think, unfortunately, this is all we had time for. I think we could carry on for another hour or so, and judging by all the questions in the Q&A, there's definitely enough space for probably 2-3 hours. But I think I want to thank Derek, Rhonda, and Robbie for your stimulating 10-minute presentations about your discipline, but also about your answers and about showing us actually, we have a lot of work to do, but work that we need to do together, of different disciplines working together. And it's not just our departments, it's our universities, it's the bigger higher education industry, or whatever you want to call it. So there's a lot there to do, but you've given us a lot of thought, train for thought about that. I want to briefly mention as well our next webinar series run by the IGDC. We run a series on COVID-19. The next one is on the 5th of March, and it's called Unpaid Care Work and COVID-19, a Missed Opportunity to Recognize, Value, and Take Action, ? So if you enjoyed this one and you want more, please sign on for that one on the 5th of March, and also follow us on Twitter. But thanks again for an outstanding panel. And I think we're all going to go into this weekend with a lot of things going on, and keep thinking about what we can do as academics to address some of these major issues that affect our discipline. So thank you so much.